Actually, yeah, it's good. All right, thanks, Ben. All right, folks, we're live. I'm here with Ben, who is our new experimental assistant, friend, helper, intern, acolyte, disciple in the cult, perhaps. And he just got back from a nice family vacation, so he's ready to roll. So he's manning the computer. We got a bunch of tabs to go through. It's been a wild ride the past 24 hours. I I wrote a tweet that I guess was naughty in some way I didn't fully understand, and my mentions have just been filled with haters nonstop. I think this is what you call getting ratioed. However, I believe getting ratioed is a huge myth. It's not a bad thing. It's actually a very good thing. It's fun, and it means that you're basically just smarter and edgier than all the bourgeois normies, and you've really kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of finding some really sore, sensitive, taboo subject that and taboo truth, to be precise, that all the rest of the people are just really angry about. That's usually what it means when you get ratioed. So it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. Anyway, I've been in the thick of it. And that's basically dominated Twitter for the past like 48 hours in my ego network, obviously not Twitter at large. This is a absolutely meaningless affair in the larger scheme of the world and culture. Having said that, though, if any of you have ever had the cursed experience of writing a tweet that lots of people hate, you will notice that it totally consumes your particular experience of the internet and your particular, thinking on a daily basis. So I've been basically just reflecting on this experience the past 48 hours because I can't fucking get away from it. This is the second time this has happened to me, so I actually do have some theoretical observations on what causes this type of phenomenon, how to interpret it and what it means, what's really going on underneath the surface. So this is going to be a theoretical analysis, folks, of media politics, and I'm going to let you see under the hood of how so-called ratioed tweets, pile-ons against innocent, truth-telling, revolutionary intellectuals such as myself who just want to speak the truth. The way that we get pounced on by mobs, I'm going to explain. I'm going to lay bare how it works and why people do this. And we're going to really get to the bottom of it. All right, so that's the idea. I'm going to, in fact, this cursed tweet of mine brought into the fold many new characters who I generally have never interacted with, such as this person, Sophie Lewis. We might have exchanged words at one point sometime in the future, in the past, but she kind of represents one of the objects of my critique in my tweet, which, by the way, I'm going to go over all of this. So if you have no idea what the fuck I'm talking about, I'm going to walk you through it. Sophie Lewis is a anti-family feminist academic woman who I think has some like really bonkers and harmful ideas. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about her and her ideas very briefly to give you some background. I'm going to explain the tweet. And then I'm also going to call out in particular this guy, Will Menaker, if that's how you pronounce it, from Chapo Trap House, because I guess I recently came across his radar and he subtweeted me. The dude didn't even have the nerve to mention my handle in his tweet. Ben, you got to fill me in if there's drama in the chat that I need to be aware of. So he did not even have the character and grace to include me so I could see what he was saying. He subtweeted me. He had the audacity to talk about me behind my back. So we're gonna look into that. We're gonna see what the Chapo Trap House people have to say about yours truly. I do believe this is the first time they've commented on me. So, we're gonna really get to the bottom of that. You do not speak ill of Justin Murphy behind his back on Twitter, his home. All right. I can't let them get away with that. So that's going to be another thing we're gonna talk about. Basically, to give you a TLDR or hint, my tweet was so explosively intelligent and transgressive that it totally melted the brains of the Chapo Trap House listeners. And frankly, I mean, up until now, I've thought fairly well of the Chapo people. I thought, they're kind of interesting, funny, edgy people, doing generally good things to the kind of current center of gravity of left-wing politics. So I've generally kind of been into them, sympathetic from a distance. I never really got into that kind of style of content or whatever, but as an audience member, but, I've had a, respectful appreciation for what they're doing in their own way. So that's why I was very upset to see Will Menaker subtweeting. Also, not just me, but Jeffrey Miller. I don't know if you saw this, Ben. He was talking shit about both of us. And basically, we'll go through it. We're gonna go through it all. You don't have to now. But yeah, I basically just want to I need to call out the haters, and I need to also clarify for all the people who are, hating on me or vaguely paying attention but don't really know what the fuck is going on with this drama and my epic nuclear take. I'm gonna basically lay it all bare now, explain everything now. So that's a little bit of foreshadowing for where we're gonna be going. But yeah, I'm just checking out the chat. What's up, people? Lots of friendly faces. How's everyone doing? Good to see you all. As always, thanks for coming out. Huge thanks to my patrons who make all of this possible. If you want to join my Discord server, you're more than welcome to. There's a link in the description. Just fill out a little entrance survey and I'll send you that link. Also, actually, a really good moment right now. This is a really good moment to appreciate my Discord server, because I was thinking about it. Like, the way that I think and the way that I write tweets, apparently it tends to trigger normal people, because this is not the first time this has happened where I've said something pretty normal, I think, and like thousands of people really hate it. Um, and then watching how it like melts the minds of people like the Chapo people, it makes me have a deeper respect for my fans and my audience and the people, especially who hang out in my Discord server. Like, those are some of the most based internet audience members ever, because they are not triggered by anything I say. They think it's quite reasonable. These are all reasonable thought experiments that I bring to the table. So shout out to everyone in my Discord server. I think it's one of the most based Discord servers around. And this kind of conflagration with normies really kind of drives that home for me. So I appreciate you. If you want to join the Discord server, there's a link below. What else? Oh, you can buy my book on Deleuze, which is going to be out soon. I'm not going to push it too hard, but yeah, if you're interested in Deleuze, buy my fucking ebook. It's going to be dope. So that there's a link beneath the show notes right here. So yeah, let's get after it then, shall we? So let's start with just the tweet itself, Ben, shall we? And it was so widely misunderstood by most people who were responding to it that I think we need to simply go over it so I can just simply explain the basic idea. All right. I thought it was obvious, but I guess it's not. So do you have it brought up for viewers? All right. So you should be looking at the screen, which shows the tweet. And by the way, folks, if you look at the metrics on this, it doesn't look like that much. 163 retweets is not that much at all in the scheme of things. And even 389 replies, not that much. But here's the thing that people don't tell you. When you get quote tweeted, that none of that shows up in the metrics. So every time someone kind of retweets your tweet and talks shit about you, I believe that doesn't show up as a reply or a retweet. And so, yeah, I'm pretty sure I probably crossed into the thousands in terms of people quote tweeting me, because it's just been nonstop for more than 24 hours now. Okay, so that's that. A little bit of background. This is the tweet. Now, if you're a reasonably balanced, smart, not ideologically possessed person, I think the message is pretty clear. Well, Ben, let me ask you actually,
Yeah, sure.
do you think the message, do you get the idea and it doesn't make sense?
No, it definitely makes sense.
Do you see like evil in this
No,
thought experiment?
No. I mean, I guess I could just see the content being touchy. So
Right.
your first reaction is going to be.
Okay, good. That's just a good reality check. What we are going to do is I'm going to explain the obvious meaning of this tweet, and then I'm going to explain the common, but like just idiotic interpretations. There was one or two kind of ways that most of the haters interpreted it that made it so scandalous, and I'm going to explain how they misunderstood and why. We're going to try to get to the bottom of what the fuck's going on there in the hive mind. So, all right. I think the idea is basically really simple. There is a strand of contemporary radical feminism which is very anti-family. The family is the site of oppression. The family is, generally something bad. Okay, let's just say, to be very blunt about it. This is perhaps emblematized or symbolized by someone like Sophie Lewis, who has a book out right now, a kind of fashionable, hip, radical left book about surrogacy. I think it's called Full Surrogacy Now. There you go. Yeah, well done, Ben. You're getting good at this, man. Very, very impressed by your skills here. Yeah. So look, her politics are very laid bare, right? It says literally feminism against family. Okay, I'm not making this up. This isn't like some conspiracy theory about how the Soros-funded left-wing theorists want to destroy your family. No, this is like concrete evidence right here. It's literally a book about how the family's bad and how we should overthrow it with things like surrogacy and renting out your womb and shit like this. Okay. So I'm not making this up. This is a strand. This is a very popular kind of fashionable strand. Here is this nice young woman, Sophie Lewis, who wants to destroy all of your families. I'm just kidding. I'm sure she's not a bad person. I'm just kind of busting her chops. I think her ideas are cuckoo and quite harmful, and I'm going to explain why. Anyway, this is just to give you some background. So there are people out there who are literally calling for the abolition of family as such, and under the banner of like radical left-wing politics. Okay, so that's one thing, right? And this is highly correlated, I would say, with people who are generally pro sex work. And I would say this camp, which is also fashionable, says that um, sex work is just another form of work. Sex workers should have rights like all other workers. And yeah, you might have your conservative reactionary judgments on whether or not sex work is good or bad. But ultimately, there's this kind of rising popular consciousness of sex workers as an important part of the proletariat who might even be representatives of, the class struggle today. And this kind of fashionable take is now very kind of popular. It's very uncool, in other words, on the left today to say, hey, I kind of think sex work is fucked up and probably shouldn't be allowed. If you think that, you're like very not cool on the left. That's an idea that has, very decreasing currency, let's say. Okay, so these are the contexts that I'm giving you. All right. When I say, if you think the family is a site of oppression and you think sex work is ethically defensible, those are the two premises of my thought experiment in this tweet, right? These are the types of people and ideas that I'm referring to. Then, ergo, you should actually think that millionaires who pay 15-year-olds money for sex are not just defensible, but you should actually see them as kind of the revolutionary vanguard. Like they're supporting political liberation in some sense. I mean, I think this just adds up from those two premises. That's basically all I'm saying. If you think the family is bad, then you should want any outside forces that are going to disrupt, the control of the father over the daughter, let's say. You're going to want young kids to escape the oppression of the family as soon as possible, right? And you are, if you are in favor of sex work and you think sex work is a perfectly, acceptable type of activity that should be, taking place out in the world today, then you have no ethical principled objection to basically people selling their bodies, and so you combine those two principles, and those are two very fashionable principles. I would say they are in the radical left today, in the kind of hip fashionable pockets of the radical left today. I would say those are the dominant ideas. Then ergo, what is your objection to someone like Jeffrey Epstein paying a 15-year-old girl a few $100 for a massage and then also sex? I mean, what is your objection if you believe those two premises? Now, here's where I don't see it. So that's the provocation of my tweet. I thought that was pretty obvious. Now, here is what 90% of the haters were confused about. And I think this is very interesting. Most of the hate that I got for this tweet was from people who thought that I support this line of thinking. So whereas I was obviously just, for anyone who knows my politics and knows what I think and write about, it's obviously I'm just showing a kind of painful, harmful kind of logical contradiction in the attitudes of kind of contemporary, fashionable, radical left ideas. So, and by the way, folks, if you're here for the first time, I'm a fucking leftist still. I consider myself essentially a radical leftist. I'm an anarcho-communist for the most part. I just happen to be also very free speech. So I have no time for the kind of moral, censorship types of trends that are very popular today. So, okay. So that's where we're at with this. But most people basically who were hating on me thought that I was endorsing this line of logic. And what's fascinating about this, folks, is that that's precisely because the two premises of my thought experiment are so popular. Like it is so normal today to think that sex work, totally cool. Nothing to see here. No problem. No, there could not be possibly anything ethically problematic about sex work in principle. That's like very normal to say sex work is cool. No questions asked. And it's very normal to say that the family is bad. It's a source of oppression. So the people who were attacking me actually just thought that I was one of those people who thinks those things. And that's really, really interesting. When you try to critique something by showing its logical implications, you get hate for doing so, not because people are even objecting to your argument, but because they literally think that you are cheerleading for the thing that you're criticizing. Because obviously people don't have time, people don't have energy, and also people are generally like, the average person is like pretty stupid. They just look for a second and they make guesses about what the tweet is doing. And they just guess that actually I'm a so in some sense, the hatred towards this type of take is evidence for the take. It's a vindication of the take because actually all those people who are hating on me are saying that they agree with the horror of what I'm laying out. They agree that that is something that exists, that that's a live threat in the culture. They wouldn't be hating on it so hard if they didn't think that my premises were in fact popular and dangerous. They're hating on it precisely because I'm right that they are popular and dangerous and that they do lead to these implications. People just incorrectly think that I'm espousing those implications. And so in some sense, like, you might dislike this kind of like barrage. You might hate being ratioed, as it were, in this sort of way. But you should actually be pretty happy when it happens because it means that you've really hit the nail on the head in a certain way. So I thought that was just interesting to note. Like, and honestly, you wouldn't even really know this unless you paid close attention to what people were saying. Like even me, for instance, this only actually kind of occurred to me recently, like earlier today, like all of yesterday, my Twitter mentions are just dominated by hatred. And like it's actually hard to know what's going on when you're in that kind of moment because it's emotional and you're like, people are vulnerable to negative like stimuli, right? Even if you think you're not, if you get hate over and over again, you're gonna kind of feel like, what's wrong with me? Um, and so it's hard to think clearly. So yeah, this observation might seem obvious, but it's not at all actually. And when you're in the heat of being ratioed with a nuclear take such as this one, you can easily just kind of cower and be like, "Oh, I must be stupid or harmful. Shame on me." And you kind of just like sulk away, like feeling bad about yourself and feeling guilty. But no, I'm telling you, if you've ever been in this position, you are the righteous one. You are the courageous truth speaker. And yeah, people like Sophie Lewis are bonkers, I think, and quite harmful. Frankly, I would love to talk to her. She's kind of game on Twitter, like she interacts with me. I wonder if she would do my live stream. It would be an interesting chat. I would be more than happy to give her unlimited space to kind of explain her book. And by the way, obviously, I'm like sympathetic for all kinds of radical ideas. That's why I'm like giving airtime to this book, even though I think it's bonkers and harmful. I like crazy ideas on the left and on the right. So yeah, I think it's kind of crazy to abolish the family. Personally, I think the family is like the greatest bulwark against capitalist exploitation. So yeah, I think it's bonkers and harmful. But I would be more than happy to talk with her. Who knows? Maybe she'll join the live stream one day. I don't put a lot of money on it, but we'll see. Any interesting pushbacks in the chat or questions or
No, it seems like some people on your side.
anything? How many people we got in the house at the moment? Just kind of curious. Always like to check the
52.
52. Okay, that's
53.
pretty good. Pretty good. That's pretty relatively high for my modest live stream. What I'm hoping is that this is by the way, folks, if you haven't noticed, for those of you who are regulars here, I'm doing something a little different here because most of my live streams are not very timely. But I'm like, okay, I'm getting all this fucking hatred on my Twitter mentions. Presumably, a lot of people are looking at my shit right now. So I'm like, all right, let's see what happens if I do a live stream that's based around some kind of like hot topic. At the moment, that hot topic is my nuclear tweet. But so I'm kind of curious. I was asking how many people are hanging out to see. I'm curious if we're like what the numbers are like because I'm curious if being timely gets you more, a more robust and active audience. What I also did, I think, for the first time ever is, dude, when you get hate on Twitter, like in large doses, you get very kind of rambunctious and it makes you kind of want to like go to war with people, and I'm pretty like not aggressive. I'm like nice to everyone. And, even people I'm calling out like Sophie Lewis and the Chapo people, like I'm not going to act all aggressive. Like I just, I like being a little combative for fun. But for the people who have been watching my shit for a long time, you'll have noticed that I actually very rarely call people out. But again, when you're getting inundated with hatred on Twitter and people are talking shit about you, especially when they're subtweeting you, you just like get this energy to want to just go on the air and kind of clap back, as rappers like to say. So we'll see. Also, I'm curious to see if my scathing responses to these haters make it back to their crews. I'm trying to basically stoke like internet, like turf wars, not real wars, not violence, but cultural combativeness. Because I thrive under these conditions, Ben. Do you not? Can you tell?
So, yeah.
All right.
You got this injection, Alexander Miller. There, you see.
All right. The obvious objection to the tweet, says Alexander Miller, is that even if you support both family abolition and sex work, you don't necessarily support pedophilia. Of course, that's true. These things are not absolute necessities. I'm drawing out correlations and possible logical implications. Obviously, the tweet is somewhat provocative. Even though I tried not to be, I thought I wasn't being provocative. I realize in retrospect that it is provocative a little bit, because I'm kind of, especially when I say that Jeffrey Epstein is to trad family values, what John Brown was to slavery. I'm clearly, pushing some buttons there a little bit, but I think that essentially still holds. So you're right. You can be in favor of abolishing the family and support sex work without necessarily supporting pedophilia. But here's the thing, folks. You can, but if that is you, what is your principle for opposing the pedophilia? Like, what's the principle there? Is there some magic? What is your magic cutoff line between like a emancipated young person who's escaping the bad, naughty, oppressive family and the and like a legitimate child who actually deserves to be protected by the family? I think that's the crux of my critique. And this is like a kind of cultural contradiction that basically no one ever wants to talk about. Like, if you want children to not be molested or assaulted or sexualized at an abusively early age, you kind of have to support family values to at least some degree. Because guess who fucking prevents young children from being assaulted? Families, and ultimately, most typically, the fathers. So if you want to throw out completely like patriarchy and traditional family values, and you want to say simply abolish the family, right? I mean, that's a categorical statement. That's a sweeping kind of irresponsible statement, if you ask me. Because if what you want to do is truly abolish the family, then in that short term, there are going to be young kids and young adults beneath an age that, beneath the age that you're comfortable with them having sex, essentially vulnerable and available to basically whatever powerful man wants to come along and have their way with them. So your only other solution, and there is one other solution, is some form of kind of government control or protection of that, right? So you can rely on the state. Now that's consistent. You can say, um, I'm against the family, I'm pro sex work, but I think the state should protect kids from abuse. That is coherent. However, the problem with that is, what is the legitimate age at which a young person who's in the oppressive family should have the legal right, even with respect to the state, to make their own decisions and escape the patriarchal control of the father, as it were? What's your answer to that? I think most people default to the legal age of consent, but the problem with that is that's philosophically inadequate and very unimpressive an answer, simply because the age of consent is different in different times and places. It could easily change tomorrow. The legislators could make the age of consent 14 tomorrow, in which case, would all of the people like Sophie Lewis, who think like the family's bad and sex work is good, are all the people who believe that, would you, after the law being changed to an age of consent of 14, would you publicly say all those 15-year-old girls that Jeffrey Epstein paid to have sex with, would you affirm that as legitimate and ethically defensible? I doubt that you would. And that's your contradiction. That's your bullshit that I'm calling you out on. And that's basically that's the point of my tweet, that there is a very dangerous kind of implication hidden in these kind of anti-family, pro-sex work, kind of fashionable subcultures in the radical left, these kind of fashionable memes. There is seriously long-term implications that are effectively extremely brutal towards the well-being of young people, not just sexually, but even more so generally. And what's going on is that right now, people like Sophie Lewis and these kind of fashionable anti-family, pro-sex leftists, what they're doing is they're kind of relying on the age of consent to do a lot of philosophical work for their positions to kind of hold it together. But the age of consent is an arbitrary legal convention. And not to mention, if you're a leftist, if you're a radical leftist, you probably think the state is oppressive, as you should. It is. You should think that the state is terribly arbitrary, as it is. And so, therefore, like the age of consent is not some magic sacred limit or cutoff. There's no particular sanctity to it. It's just another kind of arbitrary convention that the state throws up, just like all of its other kind of exploitative, you know, complicities or whatever you want to call them in a left-wing register. So yeah, basically, most people will rely on the age of consent to kind of break up my thought experiment, and I don't think it works. I think it's a cop out. So yeah, in other words, if you were wondering whether I was going to defend my tweet or back down and apologize, guess what, bitches? I am absolutely still convinced of the legitimacy and accuracy and truthfulness of my tweet. I really wasn't trying to be provocative. I understand in retrospect I was a little bit, but I think the spirit of it is like completely defensible thought experiment to show harmful kind of implications in these popular tenets that the tweet begins with. All right. Any other interesting thoughts, questions, comments, or attacks from the audience? I think we should move on then to let's talk about the Chapo Trap House people subtweeting me, because as I said, I thought better of them. I thought that they were more upright citizens than that. So here is where I catch them subtweeting me, and what was really interesting about it is that if you look at the replies in kind of like the Chapo reply guys or whatever, they're like really, really asinine. And they're basically just feeding each other's rumors and guessing about like what I'm doing in Albuquerque with Jeffrey. And I just thought it was kind of funny to see how if you write a really epic nuclear take that's ideologically vexing, other people will bring it into their communities to make fun of it, but they won't even understand what they're making fun of, and it will just roast the brains of their followers. And this is a sign of very powerful content, folks. If you want to produce powerful content, one of the markers of that, one of the ways to know that you're doing it well, is that when other people share it, it melts their brains and makes their followers and reply people like palpably dumber and more confused. And this is just a glorious example. Ben, I think you're scrolling through that. Can I see that right now? If you just look at if you look at the replies to Will Menaker subtweeting me and Jeffrey to some extent, people are just utterly confused. I mean, and to their credit, actually, some of them just say straight up, "What the fuck is going on here? I have no idea what's going on." And so credit to you for being honest. But then the other people are just guessing, and by the very end of it, it actually goes back to the gray wolf conspiracy. Go down. I don't know if they're kidding. They might be kidding, but what that is when I did my podcast with Nina Power and DC Miller, we were like talking about a bunch of shit, including like pagan shit. And there was some mention of like this hand sign as like a pagan symbol. I honestly don't even remember because I have no idea. I forget. And I've never had anything to do with it. And then literally people, it was probably Luke Turner, wrote a thing about us calling us fascists because this was proof that we were doing the fascist hand sign. It's actually the hand sign of a fascist group in Turkey. So the allegation was in all seriousness that we were communicating with our like fascist comrades in Turkey. So I don't know if they're kidding, but it looks like there's some possibility that even in the Chapo community, this type of like advanced brain rot has even affected what I thought was, the cooler, edgier wing of the radical left. So that's kind of upsetting. But then again, as I said, it's very powerful. If you can produce content that melts brains to this degree, it's a sign that you're onto some really important truths, I would say. Yeah, so I think it's real quick, pause there. I want to give a shout out to at Ryan Malady, the one noble individual replying to Will Menaker's subtweeting of us, who says Justin is actually good. Thank you, man. Shed the world on Twitter. Ryan Malady, you're the man. Thank you. Takes some courage to go up against all these people with melted brains talking shit. Yeah. So what else? Is there anything interesting there? I just thought it was basically funny how They're all so confused and kind of making stuff up. Especially like, so Will Menaker is basically peddling this like rumor now that like I'm part of the polycule. I don't know how to say this enough times, but basically, you know that Jeffrey and Diana are polyamorous. They talk about this in public, and they're both my friends, and we're all living here together. But I am not poly. My wife and I are not poly. We are monogamous. We are happily monogamous, and Jeffrey and Diana respect that. We've been friends with them for like more than 2 years now. Never had a problem. We're very clear about our boundaries. It's all good. But Will Menaker is peddling this harmful myth or rumor. Look, honestly, I'm not sensitive about it. Yes, he's saying he's calling Jeffrey a dunce. First of all, that's very mean. Don't be mean. That's my buddy. Second of all, he's calling the polycule the cuddle puddle. That's what he means. That's what he means by cuddle puddle. So basically, he's saying that it's funny that this person, me, who wrote this nuclear take, is part of Jeffrey's cuddle puddle, and I am not part of the cuddle puddle. I am opposed to cuddling, except with your lawful, married wife. All right. Actually, to be fair, I have to take back everything I just said about this because Will Menaker is saying that it's just the dopest shit ever. So, Will, thanks, man. I just caught that. Actually, you're amplifying me. I appreciate that, bro. Look, I get it. I get that the Chapo style is like, do you say Chapo or Chapo? I don't really know. I get the style.
The drug guys.
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
That's what I've never
right. I get it. I get the whole style. It's kind of ironic, kind of demure, kind of vague. You just kind of make jokes. It ain't no big deal. So I get what you're doing. That's cool. That's cool. But you better check yourself, bro. You better check your facts. I mean, you guys are making some decent money on that Patreon. I would think that you could probably hire a fact checker. I mean, I don't make half as much as that. And I have an assistant here, Ben, who's helping me fact check, kind of. So yeah, I think you should get a fact checker before you peddle myths about me and my friends. All right. Because I'm not going to let it slide. I have a live stream here. I have 50 fucking people. All right. You might have a few more than that, but I got my people and the truth will rise to the surface. So don't ever talk shit about me and don't subtweet me. If you want to talk about me, that's fine. Do it like a man. Mention me at least. I think I deserve that. But also, look, I'm not going to lie. All press is good press, baby. Right? That's what they say. And honestly, it's true. Like, you can't be afraid of getting people talking shit on you because it's just more exposure. And so, yeah, it's all good. I really don't care. In other words, it's all good. It really doesn't matter because at the end of the day, it's just Twitter. It's just the internet. And I'm just saying whatever I want, trying to say what I think is true. And then I'm just basically trying to observe the waves that are made and trying to understand the underlying media politics of what's going on. So yeah, what else? Anything else I should cover?
I think they were repeated. Is this the anti-robust is asking about? That was tweeted.
Ooh, that's a good question. So Anti-Robust asks, can you speak to the degree to which you living with primal poly presents an attack surface that otherwise wouldn't exist? So that's an interesting question, and that can be interpreted in a few ways. If you want to clarify that, feel free and go ahead. But I'm going to interpret that in two different ways, actually, both of which I think are productive interpretations. In one sense, it sounds like what you're saying is that by doing this kind of collaborative living content creation thing that we're doing, we expose ourselves to new forms of attack, that we become more vulnerable to rumor mongering and malicious gossip and stuff like that. So if that's what you mean by attack surface, like we're increasing the surface area on which we can be attacked, there's truth to that, no doubt. But it is ultimately true what they say about how, there's no such thing as bad press. And so in some sense, as long as you have thick skin, that's the key, having thick skin and knowing how to interpret things. It's actually a offensively, strategic move to increase your surface area, your attack surface. Because by increasing your attack surface, giving your haters and giving your enemies fodder to make up false rumors about you or spread malicious gossip, you're actually, as long as you don't let that get to you, that's actually all to your greater glory. That's going to basically spread your word. And so this tweet, for instance, a nuclear take with a absolutely true and I think important little piece of social critique in that tweet of mine. The only reason it got spread around so much is because of this increased attack surface. So, look at the example of Will Menaker. Like, he's only kind of even mentioning it because my collaborations with Jeffrey and Diana are, they're a kind of human interest story. And yeah, they expose or increase the attack surface, but they also give your enemies or, your friendly combatants. It's up to the Chapo trap house for them to decide which one they want to be, my enemy or my friendly combatants. That's up to them. I'll let you know what they decide. But by increasing the opportunities for people to talk shit about you, you actually are increasing your long run ultimate positive reach and influence to get your true ideas across to large numbers of people. So that's just like that's not too profound. That's pretty much like basic media jujitsu, I think, but it's accelerated in the digital context. And it's worth mentioning. And one of the reasons why I'm kind of doing this chat is because for other people who experience this, if you're not like thinking about this in this kind of political theory way that I tend to think about it, then it's easy to forget this. It's easy to lose yourself and just think like, oh, I'm so exposed to attack. I'm so vulnerable. But no, that is your power, my friend. That is an opportunity for you to actually get what you really think out there. You can ride the waves of that. So I think that's a damn good example of that, to be frank. Like, people might think I'm getting shit on, but as far as I'm concerned, I'm dominating Twitter right now. So, all right. By the way, folks, we are going to now, in about 5 minutes, be joined by a young man whose name is Joel Davis. By the way, where are all the fucking super chats, people? How am I going to pay my intern? I told my Ben here, who's doing all this screen switching, I give him 50% of all the super chats. And now you're getting stingy. Come on. So we're going to be joined by this young man named Joel Davis, who's a young theorist. I believe he's in Australia. He's kind of in this weird little subculture on YouTube of kind of political theory around what they call Neo-Absolutism and Formalism. I think that's referring to Moldbug. I'm not sure though. I want to ask him these things. I basically have just seen these guys around. I think he knows this guy True Diltom, who I think some of you, are interested in. He joined my Discord server. Joel basically proposed that we talk. So I said, yeah, sure, it's fine. I would like to learn more about all of that stuff. So I'm looking forward to having him on, and hopefully he can explain some of that to me, because I see some of that stuff, but I honestly don't really know what is going on with it. I don't know what it's all about. So hopefully he's going to explain that. He'll be joining us in about 5 minutes. So yeah, in the meantime, I guess I will just keep talking shit about people on the internet and extending my warpath, kind of building out my warpath. I mean, I want to be perfectly honest with you folks. You are at the beginning of my trajectory towards absolute internet content domination. I fundamentally believe that we are only at the very beginning of extraordinary things. And I'm not saying that I'm going to single-handedly produce them or invent them or anything grandiose and absurd or arrogant like that. However, I am going to insist, I am not afraid to insist, that I do think I have my finger on the pulse of how some of these things work with a little bit more sophistication than other people, because I am a fucking political scientist after all. And yeah, by the way, you know what a lot of people don't know is my specialty when I was a professional academic was the politics of the media. All right. So I've been thinking about the politics of media for a very long time. And I won't say I'm, an expert, because that's a kind of corny appeal to authority. I will just say that I have been thinking about this for a very long time. So when you notice that I know how to write nuclear takes that have a penchant for extreme social opprobrium, don't feel bad for me. You should be thinking to yourself, he might know what he's doing. He might have ulterior motives. Okay. All right. We got a super chat here from Anti-Robust. $2. Thank you, dude. Maybe Ben will be able to eat tonight. Maybe a package of microwave rice or something. Also, by the way, if any of you are listening who are in the active audience of Chapo Trap House or, the Sophie Lewis subcultures, you better tell them about this. You better tell them I'm calling them out. I'm out here. I'm throwing down names. I'm calling a spade, my friends. And yeah, tell them they're not going to get away with subtweeting me anymore. All right. Enough is enough. It's over. What are you laughing at?
Just the rice comment, ramen tonight with tap water. I think.
Honestly, I don't even know if you can afford to buy ramen for $1 anymore. Dude, the price of ramen is going up. This is a national crisis. We need price controls for ramen. All right. Oh yeah, Cumtown is another one, but the Cumtown is another popular kind of edgy left podcast that's kind of like overlapping with the DSA circles, but they're kind of edgier. It's more like a comedy thing. And I guess another little bit of like podcast drama is that I guess one of the dudes from Cumtown tweeted something vaguely positive about my epic take, and then he got a bunch of pushback for it because I guess like people are supposed to not like it, and but yeah, I think Nick Mullen his name was, so shout out to Nick Mullen. You have good taste and an independent mind. I'm happy to see that you're not subtweeting me. Thank you, dude. All right, Anaximimes Sagenstein. That is quite a mouthful. Throwing up that $10 super chat. Thank you. I can now pay my intern for probably enough for at least 2 packages of ramen. Very good. Thank you. John Raubach asks, J Murph, you ready to storm the Verso loft? No, I'm happy for Verso to keep doing their thing. I think Verso's cool, honestly. Like I admire a lot of their books. I grew up reading a lot of their books and really liking all that. And so no disrespect to Verso by any means. And in fact, the irony is that one thing I'd really like to do in the long run is by talking shit and writing my epic takes. Like in a weird way, like although I think people like Sophie Lewis are bonkers and I would like to see their projects not get a lot of like public influence, I'm still glad she exists. I'm glad she's able to write like her weird shit. And in my own weird way, I'm still trying to do essentially what I was trying to do in college and grad school, which is like contribute to radical emancipatory culture. You know, like I would love for this live stream, for instance, to like, you know, increase the number of books that Verso sells or whatever, even if I, you know, am, you know, vigorously attacking certain parts of what's fashionable there. So yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to make emphatically clear that this is not, I'm not like going radical right or anything like that. I never have. I'm pretty sure I never will. And all of this is to this day, I'm just trying to live out and embody my allegiance, if you want to call it that, to a robust, radical left-wing culture that involves transgression and combative debate and open, experimental, risky dialogue of all different kinds. So yeah, this is my like roundabout way of actually trying to contribute to the radical left culture, even though almost no one in the world is able to see it that way. And I get absolutely no credit from anyone on the left for doing that. That is still just how I see it. I don't really do it for likes or whatever. So yeah. So his video, his like head should be popped up.
Yeah, a little in the corner.
All right. Joel, can you hear me and see me? Oh, you might have to pump the.
I can hear you. Can you hear me fine?
Yeah, hang on. We're just getting the levels sorted. Can you turn that down a little bit? Not much, so just so it doesn't. I don't think it'll affect the mic from that far away. But
okay, how about then?
A little bit more, Ben. No, you're good. You don't have to change anything, Joel. I'm telling Ben to turn down our computer volume. Yeah, just a little bit, just enough so I can just basically hear it. All right, hang on, Joel. I'm gonna introduce you. This is the first time I'm having a guest on the show and also have an assistant. This is awesome, but I'm still getting adjusted to the routine. So real quick, did Anna Maximemes, what a fucking name that is. Did he have a message or anything he wanted to say for that $10 super chat? Because I got to give him a shout out. Well, maybe if he doesn't, then just shout out. Shout out to Anax. Oh, he says how to say it. Anaximemes. That's cool. All right. So someone says Nick Mullen is the foremost thinker of our age. Nick Mullen is woke on Pizzagate. Dude, I have to admit, this is a whole other podcast, but I watched a long ass documentary on Pizzagate, and I'm like, I would say 25% red pilled on Pizzagate. I have a lot of questions, but that's a whole other podcast. We'll get there. I don't want to keep Joel waiting. Joel, how you doing, man?
Yeah, not bad. How you doing?
Good. Thank you for coming on the live stream.
Yeah, no problem.
I appreciate it. You're calling in from Australia, is that right?
Yes.
Awesome. And so I believe you're going to tell me about absolutism or Neo-Absolutism and Neo-Absolutist ontology and formalist praxis. Is that right?
Yeah, I guess basically. So do you want me to just like introduce what it
Yeah,
is
no.
in
First,
some way?
if you could tell me, I'd love to know a little bit more about you. Just tell us a little bit about like who you are and just like what's your story as like a thinker and internet creative person.
Um, well, I'm a kind of a philosophy nerd. My favorite philosophers would probably be Heidegger and Deleuze, and Nietzsche. And I'm also a politics nerd. I can't help but like pay loads of attention to political thought and the political system and so forth. And so naturally, my interests converge between those two kind of fields of attention. My intellectual journey, I've kind of tried out basically every ideology for size at least once throughout my life. Been was raised a Christian, became like an atheist, and then I think transcended that binary now. And I guess through this kind of period of intellectual development, I eventually kind of stumbled upon neo-reactionary thought, and then I would say like the neo-absolutists are probably offering what I would consider to be an innovation, or maybe a couple of innovations from maybe what Moldbug was doing 10 years ago or so, and that really captured my attention. I feel as though that it really kind of deals with some of the problems that I was trying to work through, not just on the political level, but also like personally in like my own kind of journey. And so I guess trying to like fit these things together for myself, and then realizing, well, there's not that many other people who even know what this stuff is. It's a new idea, so I might as well participate in like actually putting content out there and communicating in the kind of scene, so to speak. So
Right.
yeah, that's
Okay. Cool. Yeah, and I saw that you have a relatively healthy little channel, not like a super big YouTuber, like just like I'm not a super big YouTuber, but you have a healthy little YouTube channel going on there. And am I right in detecting that? Are you kind of like a correspondent, if you will, with like the True Deal Tom people?
Yeah, well, True Deal Tom, Dylan, his name is, like, he and I are good friends. We were actually roommates for about 6 months.
Oh,
And
that's funny.
yeah, and we did like a bunch of streams together on his channel. I used this alias Dick Dickinson at the time. It was just kind of weird in joke. And then after that, I thought, oh, I'd like to make some of my own YouTube videos. So I made my channel earlier this year. I haven't got that many videos. I think I've only got like 4 videos and a couple streams. So
Okay, so do you like do you hang out with True Deal Tom
yeah, I mean,
to this day?
yeah, we're good friends.
So like I guess what I'm trying to get a picture of is like there's like a obscure like Australian group of people who hang out together and like are talking about absolutism and monarchy and like developing theory for like the global like monarchist takeover.
I don't know if it's. I mean, most of the collaborators are in the States, but yeah,
Oh, is that
that
right?
kind of yeah. But the internet scene, I don't know. We actually kind of became aware of one another through the scene, and then realized that we lived in the same city and we should probably hang out, and then went from there. So it's kind of like a reverse. I guess that's like you had Ebert on yesterday talking about hypermodernity. He's going to be on my channel tomorrow as well, actually.
Nice.
And that kind of notion of the internet as the world interior, kind of defining generations, these relationships, I guess, kind of rings true in this instance.
Right. Okay, cool. So maybe what I'll do is I want to ask you about your own ideas and your own work in a little bit, but let's start if you could you just kind of explain to me, because I honestly have almost no idea about this kind of like subculture, but I've seen it around. It seems like, it seems like y'all are definitely like doing something real. Like you guys have a certain dynamic and it's underway, and it seems like the real deal in terms of like actual intellectual content, and you guys are sincere and smart and trying to figure something out. But I haven't had the time really to look into it too much, so I'm pretty naive, and I think most people watching this and listening, with some small exceptions who are probably fans of you guys, have like no clue what I'm talking about when I refer to you and this like subculture. So would you mind giving us a stab at summarizing like the main ideas or the main kind of tendency of this like theoretical subculture that's seems to take place mostly on YouTube? Is that right?
Yeah, probably the best way to introduce it is to ground it in the neo-reactionary tradition, because a lot more
Okay.
people are aware of Mencius Moldbug's work.
Right.
I know I've heard you in previous streams mention that you've read a lot of UR, for example.
Yeah.
So my reading of Moldbug is that Moldbug almost develops two distinct political ideologies, excuse me, that have convergence: neo-cameralism and formalism. And in a sense, they kind of interrelate, but I think they can be divided. And you see with like Nick Land and the accelerationists, much more emphasis on the neo-cameralist aspect. Whereas in the kind of neo-reactionary blogosphere, a blogger by the name of, he had a blog called Reactionary Future. It's kind of now defunct. His name's Chris B. He kind of took things in a different direction. And I think through reading de Juvenel, he emphasized more Moldbug's formalism. And he developed this notion of ontological absolutism. And so this is kind of like the birth of our movement, I guess, is this kind of intellectual insight from Chris, where Chris basically examines liberalism and this notion of spontaneous order that's kind of like part of the whole technicalities of all the major liberal thinkers, which is that you have this like pre-societal individual, and then they just a bunch of pre-societal individuals all just start organizing together into a society. They negotiate institutions, and then society comes into being. And so we need to have, a certain amount of liberties and freedoms for each individual to like enable this process to occur. And the state is just like a secondary phenomena.
Yeah, you're saying this is the kind of conventional liberal democratic notion.
And Chris calls this ontological anarchism, which is the belief that fundamentally, like anarchism is the state or the state of nature. There's fundamentally no state, and there's human beings that organize into a society, and the state comes secondary to society. And then he contrasted this with ontological absolutism. And for Chris, and I would still agree with this, you can only really be an ontological anarchist or ontological absolutist, because the alternative is that the state comes first, which is not necessarily like in some monolithic bureaucracy like we would see in like Soviet Russia comes first, but just that somebody organizes a hierarchy around their authority, and they institute some kind of basic notions of rule, and out of that, a society then emerges. And I think anthropological evidence, you seem to see human beings have, at least in primitive societies, they still have customs and some kind of shaman or religious figure that mediates the community's disputes. And so like it seems to correspond better to my reading of history, and I think it makes a more sense. So that was kind of like the kind of birth of our notion of, well, pretty much everybody else, like Chris would still consider someone like Moldbug to have these kinds of anarchic tendencies in some parts of his writing, because he isn't fully on board with this distinction that Chris makes. And then to move beyond ontological absolutism into something with a little bit more bones on it, though, is I think Adam Katz's work. He's definitely the intellectual leader of our movement, and his blog, GA blog, where he kind of details most of his thoughts, but he's also got essays published in certain journals. He kind of combined this notion of ontological absolutism with the kind of philosophy of language and like a kind of a critique of reification, basically. And that kind of produced far more complexity, I think, in our ideas. And then kind of building that out is kind of what we've been doing since.
Okay, so that's all a very good rendering of the scene. So that was helpful. Thank you. Now, so something I want to ask you is, most people will be familiar with what absolutism means in the political sense. It's essentially monarchy, kind of absolute, centralization of power in a particular agent or body. Absolutely. And but help us think through like why you call it ontological absolutism. Like what? Just help us kind of parse that. I mean, from what I was able to read very briefly, all too briefly, it sounds like, and you just tell me if this is wrong or if I'm on the right track, it seems like what y'all are kind of saying is that like in the order of things themselves, like basically how we use language, our basic perceptions of reality, that all of that all the way down is structured by like unequally distributed power relations, and that there is somewhere at the center of all of that, like some like absolutely assertive point of power or something like that kind of holds together the whole like fabric of being. Is that like what you're driving at, or am I totally off base?
I could probably clarify that statement with basically a good way of explaining it is just that we believe that there's always somebody who is directing any kind of field of attention within which communication is occurring. So like right now, I'm speaking, you're listening. I'm directing your attention around to a bunch of ideas that are conveyed by the signifiers in my speech.
So in this context, then who's like absolute?
Well, I mean, then we to kind of really inquire into that, then we would, where did my ideas come from? They're part of a tradition, right? And then that tradition has certain members that are innovators or originators of particular ideas, and then maybe they're funded by certain billionaires, or they're embedded in certain other institutions that have their authority derived from sources further back. But the point is that by engaging in this kind of inquiry, you realize that kind of beneath all of our kind of reified declarations of truth, there's an actual performative like hierarchies that are kind of imbued all throughout like human society. And this kind of corresponds, I think, quite well to like kind of Deleuze's notion of like the order word being kind of like that language has a function that when people have ideas, so they're participating in what like a kind of collective enunciation, they're actually being coordinated by a sign regime into acting in a certain way. They're kind of the flows of their desires and intentions and so forth are being structured by the signifying regime. But we're saying, well, these things don't just like come out of the ether, like they're actual human agents.
So I think like most people can get down with that, but am I right in understanding that the absolutist component of what you're saying, though, does that imply that at the bottom of this kind of web of structuring forces, at the bottom of it, there must necessarily be one kind of unified absolute point? Is that part of what you're saying? Yes. Or that's true? That's right.
So there's a distinction between ontological absolutism, which is just the notion that somebody's always in charge of a particular social scene because it's functioning in a kind of, if everyone has a shared understanding or intelligibility of what's going on, then they're operating within a signifying regime that must have a shared origin.
Sure.
But then the political system, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's like Rockefeller sitting behind pulling the strings of everything, controlling everyone, and we don't realize or something.
Right.
The political ideology of Neo-Absolutism is a response to the recognition of ontological absolutism. They're two distinct categories. I would prefer to say formalism is the response to ontological absolutism, because what we're saying is, well, everything is being controlled by these hierarchies, so how about we just speak the truth about them, unconceal them, develop a kind of way of speaking and understanding the political that recognizes these as just ontological facts of human organization, and then structure our institutions around like being truthful about this, rather than what liberalism does, which is creates a bunch of kind of reified notions of the free market or free individuals and democracy and all these notions where, out of the spontaneous order of like egalitarian organization or kind of horizontal, symmetrical interactions, then like social orders then emerge, just like in this kind of like a magical kind of emergent stratification. So that's kind of why we're kind of like pragmatically formalists in a way, saying, well, okay, so this is what's happening, so let's just speak the truth about it and organize accordingly.
So I guess what I'm trying to wrap my head around is how, like, a lot of what you said up until now is actually not very controversial, even to like a typical kind of contemporary, like postmodern lefty. Like, they would agree with you in saying that behind all the things we say and do in any particular situation, there's this web of forces acting on us that attune us, and there's a signifying regime, and they would even agree that there's hierarchy, right? Because that's kind of the objection and the critique to status quo capitalist culture or whatever, that it's hierarchical and oppressive. And so I think lots of people are going to be totally on board with what you're saying, but help me understand how what you're saying is different from that kind of conventional perspective. Like, what I'm still trying to grok what makes absolutist ontology absolute.
Okay, so there's two aspects. The first aspect would be, I would consider what we're doing here to be almost like postmodern, in the sense that postmodernism, if you read something like Foucault or Deleuze, they are trying to unconceal basically all of these like hierarchical relations embedded within the reifications of liberal culture and modernity in general. And they're saying, look at this, we're being controlled by these hierarchical institutions and we're being oppressed, and look how terrible this is. Where I would take a different attitude and say, well, that's how everything always is. Like if you deterritorialize a particular sign regime and create lines of flight out of it, all that does is just open up potentiality for some new sign regime to emerge that reterritorializes it into a new hierarchical structure. That's all of human history. And the only way that anything can be intelligible, the only way that you and I can have a conversation that makes sense is if we're operating within sign regimes, we're accepting essentially the authority of particular sign regimes for us to even have an intelligible conversation within. There has to be something significant that we both implicitly agree upon that's already preordained by our tradition. And so I'm saying, instead of freaking out about this and being juvenile, and I guess what we're saying, not just what I'm saying, instead of freaking out about this and being juvenile, let's just recognize this as a fact and say, okay, well, we can either be alienated from one another in this kind of absurd, childish drive for liberty and drive for liberation from, these embedded structures of meaning, or we could recognize that to be human, there's an aspect of participation in something larger than oneself, to have this like romanticized notion of individuality, that the end of your life is just, it's liberalism again, basically, this idea that we need to have this like self-interest and live our life for our own purpose and so forth. And I'm not trying to like do away with any kind of notion of individuality, and I find creativity and all these things wonderful, but we have to recognize that that's a secondary phenomena that emerges from these larger socio-symbolic processes that transcend the scope of our individual capacity. Okay. And so just speaking the truth about it and saying, okay, well, how do we direct attention toward the actual sign regimes that are working successfully and reverse this kind of process of alienation? I think my fundamental critique of liberalism is that it's alienating. Most people are kind of concerned with, oh, well, I don't want to be controlled, I don't want to be oppressed. I mean, to me, that's like a kind of a secondary problem. I'm more concerned with alienation itself. And I think what we're trying to do is reverse this kind of postmodern alienation by recognizing, well, if we're going to have a system of obligations and roles in society that are coherent and everyone understands one another's responsibilities, we need to actually assign responsibility to someone to decide how that works. That's just how human organization has to work.
Okay. So is that where the absolutism comes in? It's in saying that because of this kind of interpretation of ontology, the way you see it, it requires the necessity of a single unified ruler or monarch. Is that how you see it?
Well, I mean, that to me would be the goal, right? I mean, I would say like I'm a formalist in terms of my praxis, and then like the goal would be, like, ultimately, if we're trying to live in a society, it would be nice if we could clarify the kind of power centers down to one fundamental sovereign, because that way we would not have conflict between power centers, which is what we're experiencing right now, I think, in society. And I think that produces a lot of alienation between ideological groups, for example, where you've got like a particular group in the social body that recognizes its interests as being in conflict with another group, or like the workers or the capitalists or the, blacks and whites or women and men or whatever. And that ultimately this it's like a sociological pathology, I think. This is what I mean by alienation being a problem, not just problem in terms of like existential, oh, I want to have meaning in my life, although that's important. It's more like the social body exists as a higher stratification entity. We're not just individuals, we're also part of collectivities. And the state, I believe, is like the kind of codifying mechanism that holds the social body together through laws and practices and traditions and so forth that maintain its structure. And so when we have these kind of liberal pathologies where we have groups viewing each other as enemies, what we then have is basically a state of like internal contradiction that will, I think, ultimately oscillate out, and we can already see into negative social consequences. And so the solution to that is, okay, let's just let's formalize power, basically, to try and end these kinds of conflicts as much as possible. I mean, obviously, to have this kind of utopic vision is kind of silly. I'd rather be more pragmatic and work towards something rather than just posit some reified abstraction and say that's what society needs to be.
Yeah, that makes some sense to me. That's cool. Thank you for that. So Could you also tell the audience a little bit more about what you mean by formalist praxis? Because that's not going to be obvious to a lot of people.
Yeah, okay. So like Moldbug's idea of formalism was just simply that look at the kind of power relations that are in society as they are, and for political expediency, for his purposes, he was like, let's just give them all official titles. So like if the New York Times and Harvard and the CIA or whatever run America, give them the official titles of government and say, okay, now you're in charge. Because for Moldbug, the kind of cathedral complex, the way that it had to operate was through this kind of what Adam Katz would call super sovereignty, where you have the president and the state itself that has the formal titles of authority, and they have the legitimacy apparently of being elected or what have you, but then they're constrained by the constitution or whatever. But then you have all these other like super state entities that are mostly responsible for propaganda, ideological coercion, academia, media, so forth, that kind of, and all these NGOs and think tanks and bureaucracies and so forth that kind of create government policy from without. And they have to use this ideological mechanism to then justify its uptake into the state, and then through all these indirect means. And for Moldbug, all of these indirect means of these external agents usurping control of the state indirectly produces all these secondary effects that are undesirable, which I would agree with. And so his solution is, well, let's just give them the formal title so they don't have to engage in all of this sociological damage to like conceal their authority within the moral narratives that are currently operating. And so, I mean, I think liberalism is dying. Postmodernism was just like I think a barb to the heart of postmodernism in like the Western intelligentsia, at least. And so I think we have space now to develop something that's more reasonable and that can solve some of these problems. So that's
okay. Yeah, that was great. That was a very good rendition of Moldbug's idea of formalism, which a lot of people wouldn't be familiar with. So well done on that. Now, it would be cool if you wanted to tell us a little bit more about kind of your particular individual project. Like, what are you trying to figure out? What are you working on in this kind of tradition, as you call it, of formalist praxis?
Yeah, so where I started was the kind of like post alt-right nationalist scene. That was where we were able to kind of, like Dylan's channel already had that kind of audience, and we were speaking to some of the people in that scene. I went through more of like a libertarian to reactionary pipeline than just becoming like a white nationalist or something. But I knew a lot of other white nationalists and so forth. And so we tried speaking to them and saying, hey, look, like white nationalism doesn't really work for these kinds of, like, explain the power theory to them pragmatically and try to convert some of them into our worldview. And we've had some success with that, where, you know, through using this kind of, I think, interface, it's a lot. It creates less hostility in people like on the far right, for example. But then I thought, well, the far left, I think the same thing. So now where I'm trying to move is to, I mean, I already understand Deleuze pretty well. I also want to move into like kind of understanding Zizek and Lacan better, and the kind of what I consider to be the high agency left wing, and start opening conversations with them, because I think they can also see. I mean, what the far right.
That's a cool phrase. The high agency left wing.
Yeah, but what the far left and far right have in common is that they both see that liberalism is dysfunctional from different perspectives. I think both their perspectives have validity in certain ways, and that there's problems. And so I think talking to both of those ends of the spectrum, and trying to the kind of probably the higher end of that spectrum. I mean, like the kind of skinheads and like Antifa members and so forth probably won't like what I have to say, or even probably won't even understand what I have to say. But that's kind of what I'm trying to do, is open that discourse and talk to those people and say, okay, like if we really want to kind of move beyond capitalism, move beyond liberalism, move beyond this kind of particular kind of neoliberal project that we can all agree is terrible, how do we actually go about doing this? And so that's what I'm kind of doing right now through this YouTube and like things I'm writing and people I'm talking to, is just trying to like develop that as a network and a community. And then once we keep building that community of high quality people that have the capacity to participate in building institutions and so forth, take it to the next level, hopefully, where we can move that into the level where we have journals and think tanks and we can become like a legitimate part of the intellectual scene in the West. At least as like put this as an option on the table. Like, okay, we've got a diagnosis of the problem and we've got a solution. I don't think anyone else really does, and then go from there.
Well, I don't think you need journals or any of that shit to be like part of the scene. I think you're already doing it. But I think like the future of the intellectual scene is people like you guys. How old are you? You're young. You're young, right?
Yeah, I'm 24.
Yeah. I mean, I would not get bogged down thinking like, how can you set up journals and create these structures that imitate like what you think the kind of establishment was, you know, a couple years ago? Because all of that stuff I think is going away. Like, I think, you know, just having real thoughts and working on them sincerely and putting them out there wherever people are congregating and having conversations is going to be the new, that just is going to be what the intellectual scene is. So, yeah, and it seems like y'all have a weird, interesting, but like developing research agenda. So I would say, you know, you don't even have to aspire to that so much as you're already doing it. Just keep doing what you're doing if you want to make an impact on the scene, as it were. That's just my 2 cents. I mean, so am I right though in getting from you that your basic vision, just for like the non-theoretical people in the room, is like what you're ultimately kind of going towards is a kind of monarchist system? I mean, other like would your practical ideal vision of a polity be substantially different than like what most people have in their mind when they think of like divine right monarchy?
Well, the difference between like a divine right monarchy and this kind of autocracy that I'm kind of putting forth is that you know, under like in the Middle Ages, the king's legitimacy came from the church. So I mean, the church in those days functioned like the New York Times and Harvard and all the liberal intellectuals do today, of justifying why this person's in charge. And you know, if the liberal institutions decide that the particular person in charge has gone wrong with them, then they can change the justification. And now you're seeing that with someone like Trump, who's elected president, whatever you think of him, he's not capable of actually putting forth his agenda. It's a value-free judgment. I'm not saying that his agenda is good or bad, just he obviously is failing to put forth most of his ideas because he doesn't have the backing of the kind of, what would you call, super sovereign apparatus, basically, that exists above him. And so what I'm proposing is just decapitating that and saying, okay, well, if we're going to have somebody in charge, they should have enough responsibility to be, if they have the responsibility of the ultimate decisions in our society, they should have the power and authority to actually make those decisions. And actually, I think what we're seeing, I mean, this is related to like a critique of capitalism. I think what this is really fundamentally about, and most people on the left, I think, would agree with this, is that the state is limited through all of this liberal ideology, but then the corporation can then expand, and we have all these transnational corporations, and we have, through neoliberalism, like the IMF and the World Bank and all these globalist institutions, enable corporations to kind of almost transcend national sovereignty and then start putting demands to sovereign governments. I see this as a massive problem because ultimately, what do large corporations like? What responsibilities do they ultimately have to anybody? They're acting purely for the generation of profit and so forth. I see this as highly problematic. So I think we've come to a situation in which you can either take the sign regime of capitalism, or you can take some kind of autocratic sign regime where the kind of flows of capital are kind of brought under the control of some kind of state hierarchy that has formalized power. And I believe that would be a far better alternative. Not that you wouldn't still have like markets operating in isolation in sectors of the economy to manage like interactions, but that ultimately you need to have the state apparatus as with the capacity to kind of preside over the process from above. And so, I mean, that's kind of where I'd be heading. It's kind of an autocracy that is justified by itself. Like the fact that we need somebody to run everything, because things need to be run by someone, and we need somebody to actually clarify the obligations that each of us have in an intelligible way, so we know what responsibilities we can hold everybody else to and take them to court and say, well, this is your responsibility and you failed. And so once that person is established, then we can then go about the process of cleaning up the mess of society, so to speak. But until that process is done, then it's just this kind of ideological team sports and kind of basically reifying abstractions, and beneath them is all these like power relations are concealed that are then subtly operating. So,
okay, I get that. Now there's a question from Nothing here in the chat. His name is Nothing, not a question from Nothing, but someone named Nothing. For $5 here, he wants to know. I'm assuming it's a he. Probably 99% of people in this chat right now are a he. The question is for you, Joel. Have you heard of Hop? I think that's how you pronounce it. The libertarian theorist guy. He's like the Austrian economist guy, theorist. And if you have, what are your thoughts on his defense of monarchy?
So from my understanding, Hopper's defense of monarchy was that if you have some kind of like formalized sovereign, that they're, because of their longer time preference, because society becomes their property, they're going to make like basically better decisions than a democracy would, because a democracy only needs to perpetuate its power for these like short-term 4-year cycles, and so there's no incentive for long-term planning. I think that you can see an example of this in like China absolutely killing America economically for like the last 20 or 30 years. So I would agree with that, but it's kind of low resolution. Like, we're not going to be able to organize society around like some time preference argument, right? There has to be something. And I think that's why I'm focused on something like alienation, that ultimately we're undergoing a process as a culture where the kind of obligations and roles that we all share, the institutions that hold together our society, are kind of being broken apart, and mostly broken apart by revolutionaries that are resentful toward them as being oppressive in one way or another. And the only way that we can kind of stop this from occurring, this kind of deterritorialization and then reterritorialization by the basically the commodification process of capitalism and techno-capitalism, basically, because all the other sign regimes are kind of being disintegrated, is like, well, hold up, maybe we don't want to just be atomized into these like consumption units that are controlled by this kind of industrial technological complex. Maybe there's like some alternatives that are more preferable. That's the way I would be looking at it.
Right. Okay. I hear that. Now, I feel like we should talk a little bit about Deleuze, because y'all are kind of interested in Deleuze, I think, right? And you cited him, I think, if I recall correctly, as high agency leftist. And I don't know if you would know this, but I'm currently writing a book about Deleuze. Pre-order available. The link is in the description. Sorry, terrible. Something in my throat. It's only $5. You get it right now. It'll be out in a couple months, and not even a couple weeks, really. And anyway, so that's on my mind. I've been kind of deep in Deleuze recently. And, one thing that comes to mind there is that, as I'm sure you're aware, he's very into the univocity of being. And this comes from Duns Scotus. So it's quite a long-standing idea. And the idea there basically also runs up through Spinoza and into Deleuze, which is basically, it's kind of reminiscent of what you were saying about absolutism or absolutist ontology, if I'm kind of picking up what you're putting down. It's a kind of it's an idea that there is a kind of unified substance that runs throughout divinity and also kind of human agency. That there is no real split or dualism between like God and man and mind and body, that there is ultimately being is unified. Being is, in that sense, absolute, you could say. And, it kind of splits and divides into different modes and attributes, depending on the circumstances. And that's kind of the history of the universe or life on Earth. And, but it's this insistence that at the end of the day, there are not these divisions. There is ultimately kind of one substance to being. Does that drive quite closely with ontological absolutism?
Yeah, well, I mean, like, I'm very influenced by like Nietzsche's notion of the will to power, which is probably an equivalent concept that obviously influenced Deleuze as well. But I think what I really get from Deleuze, and I mean, I haven't mentioned it yet, but generative anthropology, which you might not have heard of, is this kind of obscure discipline that kind of informs Adam Katz's work, who I'm owed to be able to even say anything that I'm saying right now immeasurably. The reason why I didn't bring it up is because then we'll just get bogged down talking about it as a conceptual apparatus, and then probably be alienated from talking about the issues. But that would probably be a good topic for a future discussion between us. But a convergent idea between the two ideas is this kind of preferencing of immanence over transcendence, and of, I guess, like ontologies of the event versus like kind of ontologies of essence, that kind of abstract some kind of transcendental, reified domain from lived experience and performance mediated through signification.
Are you sharing the screen? Go ahead. We're trying to bring up Adam Katz. We're not sure. I think there's a few of them, but you can tell us if. Did he write a book called Postmodernism and the Politics of Culture?
I don't know. Maybe he did. It sounds like the kind of thing he would write, but I don't know that if he did actually write that.
Are you screen sharing this?
If you go GA blog, GA blog, that's his blog. If you want, like.
Okay, cool. Yeah, Ben is finding it. Okay, cool. Yeah, Ben's just going to explore that and kind of show people who are watching what the blog looks like. So, okay, cool. And so, what is like the future for you folks? Like, I'm picturing like you and Shrew Diltom like meeting up in like a dark, shadowy cafe in like Australia or something like that, plotting to like develop the next like blockbuster theoretical work that's going to like usher in monarchism to the West. How does that play out? How does that look to you?
Well, I mean, at this moment in time, we're still in, I guess, what you could call the research phase. Ultimately, this is going to result in books being published. I know that both Chris and Adam, who I mentioned earlier, both have books coming out. Chris pretty soon.
Who do they publish with? Do they self-publish or what?
I can't remember the name of the publisher. I don't know if Adam's book is published by the same publisher or not. But there's like a kind of.
I can't imagine that there's like a lot of publishers really like that hot new monarchist theory. Like, I imagine the literary agents just dying to. Oh man, we got to get these kids who are interested in not only Deleuze but Deleuzian monarchism. There's the market. The market for this is just so large. I can imagine that people are falling over themselves to get those manuscripts from you. So no, I mean, are you guys like kind of publishing yourselves or what?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously there's internet presence. Ultimately, like essays. I prefer essays. I think with the modern like or the hyper modern, to use Evert's term, person having this kind of fractured capacity to pay attention. Most people don't actually read books anymore, so it's much better to write essays that people can read in a shorter sitting to convey a particular idea. That's kind of my preference. But anyway, we're going to put work out as a group over the next few years, and we're going to keep talking and keep trying to expand our influence and expand the conversation, bring other people into it that have quality, and ultimately try and convert that into actual institutions. And then hopefully we can then elicit some kind of network with the power structure that exists. Because what we're trying to offer is a way of technically operating and also interfacing an entirely new way of government, of kind of producing government, basically. So surely there's a lot of people in society with an interest in that. So trying to find out who they are, like people that have lots of money or power already that think that would be a good idea would be quite nice, and that we can then work together. That would be like the ultimate end goal.
Okay. I have one question for you. I think, what do you say to people who, like leftists and kind of normie people who kind of point to these like fringe circles that are interested in monarchism? People will point to people like you as, this like evil, far right cabal of like people who just want to like dominate others and kind of enact like these highly oppressive systems to basically like control everyone in this like really, there's this really kind of very nasty kind of image of anyone who would talk seriously about monarchism today. So I'm curious, like, what do you say to those people, or how do you think about those people? Like,
so what I would say to those people is there's two things I would say. The first thing I would say is that we're already under control, right? And we're going to be under control. So it's just a matter of what kind of control, not a matter of control, because that's where I'd begin and say, okay, so that's ontological absolutism, right? Once we've established that, I'm not a bad guy for saying we should have this particular control, that particular kind of control, because I mean, surely there's a preference once you establish that it's there. The second thing I would say is if you look at something like liberalism, liberalism is paradoxical in the sense that the more rights that we keep coming up with in liberal societies, the more excuses we have for government to expand. So if the government exists just to defend our rights to property, it doesn't have to be that big. But then when you need to worry, when we have rights to education and the right to the correct gender pronoun and the right to all these new rights that we keep developing all the time, the more government bureaucracy needs to expand, the more the state has to kind of involve itself in our everyday lives. And so every time we kind of postulate some kind of new freedom, what we're really doing is imagining an enhanced form of sovereignty to control people. So I think what I'm doing actually is trying to do the opposite. I would consider the crazed left or the leftist as the one that's actually the maniacal tyrant trying to kind of expand their control, really. I would like to see the average middle-class person kind of left alone mostly. And I'm trying to figure out how do you kind of resolve the contradictions of liberalism so that we can get on with just having a kind of stable, normal, well-functioning society, really.
Right. And I mean, something I would also add is that there's nothing about monarchy that precludes generous and stable redistributive systems or welfare systems, right?
There's nothing about. I mean, well, we can look at the example.
You can have an absolute ruler. In other words, you can have a monarch and also have generous welfare states.
Well, yeah, you could, but the way that authority will always need to work is through delegation as well. So it's not like if you have a social system of 300 million people like you do in America, and you have somebody who's the dictator, to use the kind of loaded term, they can't control everything. There's too much shit going on. So they have to basically create delegations and give other people responsibilities that then send those responsibilities down the pipeline. And so ultimately, when it comes to things like economic policy or dealing with the underprivileged or any kind of like problematic social phenomena, they'll have to employ teams of experts to come in, analyze the problem, and propose solutions. And you would think if you have this kind of clarified hierarchical model, the best qualified people would likely get put in those positions, and it would be dealt with in a way. It wouldn't be like you would have this tyrant who would not give a shit about everybody else and be like, screw all of you, like I'm king of the world, like just doing coke and driving his Ferrari around and just like just being completely arbitrary, because he's not going to last very long, right?
Right.
In order to be a good leader, you actually have to do your job. And I think the pressure on the higher up in a hierarchy you are, anyone who's been successful in any domain of life, the more obligations and pressures that you have as a person. And so, I mean, if you look at, I mean, every system is going to have corruption, and there's always going to be the human condition. There's always going to be problems, but it's just like, do we want to like lie about it, or do we want to try and just be honest as possible about how shit works, and then act kind of pragmatically in response to it?
Right. Another crucial point in Moldbug's thinking is the kind of implicit expectation that there would be a bunch of competing monarchical systems, right? So there's that kind of competitive accountability mechanism that kind of forces the various monarchs to be good, essentially, to be honest and enforce order, but also possibly you can imagine, like, if there's a patchwork of monarchies, you could imagine that to have a healthy polity to attract good citizens, you have to offer them things like a welfare state and a certain amount of redistributive, like, social cohesion. And so that is something else I would like remind people who think like monarchy is just like utterly bonkers, evil, oppressive kind of like idea. I mean, I'm not a monarchist necessarily. I haven't thought about it enough to I'm not a monarchist at all, just because I haven't really thought about that very much. And I tend to be quite skeptical myself of centralized rule, and I think the kind of distributed multiple power centers might be preferable, but I'm obviously
Can we talk about that? Can we talk about how does like distributed multiple power centers actually work? Like, who's doing the distributing, and how are they not a central authority?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I don't have a very cultivated horse in the race of like monarchism versus non-monarchism, because like many people today, I kind of take for granted that monarchy is bullshit and kind of outdated. But I don't. But I appreciate rethinking that. Like that's why I'm talking with you, because I think it's interesting and provocative. So I'm definitely not dismissing monarchism, is what I'm saying. But all I'm saying is my intuitions kind of lean against it. I mean, I guess I'm happy to kind of rehearse the argument if you want to tear it down. I guess the argument would be that the ideal is you have multiple competing projects for kind of social reality construction that are kind of constantly ongoing, and that, sure, I would bite the bullet that of course there's some kind of hierarchical structure within each of those competing systems, but the ideal would be to have, this kind of anarchy in which there's no one particular system with formal control over everyone else, but what actually happens is they're all kind of competing organically in this kind of like wild outside. You could argue that this is basically like kind of realist international political theory, essentially, like basically realist international relations theory. Like if you look at the global system, for instance, there is this kind of stability that you get from a bunch of states essentially seeking to defend and maximize their own survival and nothing else. If you have a bunch of states in a system doing that, it actually you can actually converge on quite stable equilibria. And apparently, like in the global system, that has, it certainly hasn't been perfectly stable by any means, but there's a kind of logic of stability that is kind of desirable and but also competitive by not having any kind of overarching enforcer. So that's how the argument would go. I presume you don't buy it, but maybe you could tell me why.
Well, first of all, that second aspect of what you said, I mean, yeah, that's the Anglo-American structure of global imperialism that you've just described, right? Where you have, well, we've got this notion of rational self-interest and the nation state, and we're going to create the UN and impose it upon the entire world, and then kind of create through the wonders of reified abstractions, make out like as if there's this neutral competition between these competing power centers, but really it's American hegemony that enables the world order to be structured in that way. The second thing
that's interesting, because that's kind of like a left-wing critique. So that's kind of interesting. Yeah, go on.
Yeah. And the second thing that I would say, which gets back to the origin of what you were saying, where this more abstract notion you have of we want to have competition between different clusters of signifiers, and like each of these signifiers have their own internal hierarchy, but they're competing with one another, and the individual can choose between them in some way. So the competition between them is what basically keeps them honest. That's like and this is the kind of same argument that like a free market economist would make, right, for capitalism. The problem with that I see is how do you define competition? Because traditionally, all throughout world history, the way that different clusters of sign regimes compete with one another is through violent conflict and the attempt to assert or usurp the authority of one and impose oneself and colonize the people and resources and so forth inhabited by another system. And so the only way that you prevent violent confrontation between them is to create a larger system that mediates. And that's how the economy works. You create a state that creates property rights, and that enables corporations to compete with one another, where you don't have like Google nuking Yahoo or something because they have like basic they have to compete within the system that's been set up. And so I would say, okay, yeah, this notion of competition is good, sure, but the only way that it works is through a larger authority mediating it, or what you have would be like one system that would become more powerful because it's better than the others, that would then gain more resources, better in the sense of more effective, right? Not like, but it would gain more resources, more and be able to dominate other systems and then establish hegemony. And so either way, you're just kind of kicking the can down the road to hegemony with one flavor or another. So I just, again, like I would say, just acknowledge that this is how shit works, and then maybe build a kind of political ontology that actually integrates with the realities of what we see all throughout like human history. I mean, I would consider these kinds of anarchic worldviews to be ahistorical, really.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's interesting. And definitely a lot to chew on. Well, Joel, was there anything else you wanted to, share with the audience, or throw at me, or anything else you want to put on the table for us to discuss? Because this was fun and interesting, and you definitely helped me kind of get a better sense of what's going on in these so-called Neo-Absolutist circles that you're involved in. So this has been good, but I just wanted to open it up to you if there's anything you wanted to get in before we probably start to wrap it up.
Yeah, I mean, I think the last thing that I would say is that I don't think I'm a leftist or a rightist in the sense of there's like so many things that I say sound like I'm a communist, and then so many other things I say sound like I'm a fascist or whatever. But I mean, because the answer is that because I'm neither. I think this is completely just distinct, different thing that you can't fit within the political spectrum. I would consider the political spectrum to be a kind of product of liberalism, and this is a post-liberal idea. And so I think the temptation is to ideologically categorize, but I think then to understand what we're saying, you have to kind of step outside of ideology and look at what we're saying on ontological terms, realistically. And like ultimately the guiding kind of moral worldview that I have, that I think that Adam communicates as well in his writings, is essentially the alignment of power with responsibility. Power exists. It's an ontological fact. The idea is it should be as responsible as possible. So people who have power should be held responsible for that power, and people who have responsibility should be given enough power to be able to actually do whatever they're responsible for. That's how that would be like a very basic way of kind of thinking about what's the most functional society possible, and that's kind of what we're working toward. And so, I mean, I was a Marxist at one point. Adam was a Marxist at one point. Like, we're not just like, like white nationalist skinheads that are, I mean, Adam is a Jew, right? He's like full-on Ashkenazi Jew. So he's clearly not like, like the second, like he's not the reincarnation of Hitler or something. You know what I mean? So I would just leave it with that for the kind of leftist section of your audience, probably, to like, hopefully, I don't know, have something to chew on there.
Yeah, no, that's really useful. Yeah, no, this has been fun. This is interesting. I definitely have a better picture in my mind of what you all are up to and what you think. And I think for a lot of other people who I've kind of been hearing about you or kind of seeing you vaguely on YouTube, who don't really know what you're up to, I think this will be a good short kind of one-stop shop for people to just kind of hear in one sitting, like what's going on with you all. So this was really helpful, and thanks for this, Joel.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you.
Yeah. So all right. I did a long bit before you got on the show, so I'm a little tired now. I think we'll wrap it up. But people who are listening, there's a link to Joel's YouTube in the show notes below. So check that out. Subscribe to his channel, talk to him, hit him up. I think, Joel, you're pretty approachable on the internet, right? If people want to chat you up, you're open to that. So there's links to Joel's stuff below. And big thanks to you, Joel, for contributing to the show and helping us understand this interesting little pocket of theory. And big thanks to everyone for hanging out. Big thanks to my patrons, of course, as always. And Joel, I'll let you go now, man. If you want to, unless you want to if you want to promote anything or whatever, up to you.
Just that, I mean, I've got Ebert promoting his book on my channel tomorrow, which would be an interesting conversation to connect. If people watched your program yesterday or the day before, I did.
On David Ebert, yeah.
Yeah, and maybe that would be an interesting conversation as like a trifecta of how we all talk to one another. I guess it kind of worked out like that by accident. It seemed spontaneous order.
Yeah, it's cool. I mean, there are many weird things brewing right now in the kind of like counterculture, I guess you'd call it. Like, it's not even as you were saying, it's not even left or right. Like, it's just kind of, I think more and more people who are just kind of interesting and unique are just going kind of radically independent, going on the internet, and then they're talking with each other, and then second order kind of networks are emerging in this kind of weird, unpredictable way. So it's an interesting time for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool,
man. Well, thanks again. And I'll be in touch with you. Hit me up.
No worries.
Good luck on completing the system of monarchist theory and absolutist ontology. No, it's seriously, it's all interesting stuff. And I hope you guys make some, interesting advances and keep like provoking, political theory debates. I think it's a worthwhile kind of angle that you guys are pursuing, even though I'm, only learning about it now. I'm not like necessarily sold on it. I think it's like worthwhile. And, the basics that you laid out for me today, make enough sense to me. And it seems like from what I see about you guys, you have enough, real questions and puzzles that you're really working on to get a lot of mileage out of it. So, I hope you guys keep doing what you're doing. And I look forward to see what kind of ideas and, solutions you're able to proffer.
Yeah. Sweet.
Cool, man. All right. Take it easy, Joel. Later. All right, folks. Cool. thanks for hanging out. If you're here for the first time because you're friends with Joel or whatever, yeah, please do subscribe. As I said before, big thanks to the patrons. As I mentioned in this talk, I am writing a short book about Deleuze. It's only $5. It's going to be done in a couple weeks, and already has like something like 70 something orders or something like that, which is not bad for like a pretty fringe little random creative project. But I've been working hard on it. I think it's pretty dope. I'm actually pretty pumped on it. I think it's going to be like quite a good little book that really matters in its own little way. So yeah, there's a link below. What else? Ben, you got anything you want to throw on the table? Thanks for the help. You're getting very good at the tab management. How is it on your end?
Oh, it's good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Fun.
And we both made like $6 today.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's
What I'm in it for, then.
it's all yeah, it's almost minimum. It's almost half of minimum wage.
True.
Almost. So we're getting there. Cool. Thanks everyone. I appreciate you hanging out as always. If you want to get in the Discord server, I always say that you just hit me up or there's a link below. What else? I have this kind of like routine of things to say. Those are the main things. That's about it. Yeah.
Upcoming live streams.
Right. Upcoming live streams. I got a bunch of stuff like half planned, but people are so fickle. Like there's like 5 people who are like talking to me and they're like, game to do a live stream. But people don't like making plans, or they like, they kind of like people like to be cool, and they don't want to try too hard, so they'll like leave you hanging for like a couple days because they're like too busy dealing with their like successful Patreon campaign or whatever it might be. So yeah, there's this weird like in the kind of podcasting, live streaming, like independent media world, there's this weird kind of like replication of kind of like classic kind of like high school like games of like who's cooler than other people and who's more powerful, and people like evaluate how many followers the other people have to decide whether or not they're going to do your show. And then they'll say like, oh yeah, I'm open to it. But then maybe they'll like kind of drag their feet. And yeah, I mean, I'm kind of not like that. Basically, anytime anyone asks me to do any show, I just say yes. But like, there are a lot of people out there who, 1 minute they want to do the show. What will happen, honestly, is like, when I guess like when my shit is hot and like people are saying good things and like the buzz about me and my work is positive, people will be like, reaching out. They like want a piece of the Justin Murphy experience, if you want to call it that. And but then like people are very sensitive and people are very fearful right now. So what will happen is if I get in some trouble for something, some of the people who like originally they wanted to get on the Justin wagon, then they're kind of like they become standoffish and they're kind of not so sure about getting on the Justin wagon. And in fact, what's actually happening, and this is almost always the case, is people are mostly just looking around them to get social cues from other people about who should be pursued and who's like desirable and valuable. So in the long run, that all cancels itself out. Like if you are doing good stuff and you have a true message and you're interesting and like authentic and you have other good qualities like being real or being honest or being courageous or whatever the fuck, if you have a real signal, you will always, like, in the long run, it's like a stochastic time series, right? Where it's like there's volatility, but it's always like increasing on average. I find that that's how the independent media culture game is. It's like the more provocative you are, the more, and especially if you're persistently non-ideological, what happens is you're even harder to code. So people don't know what to make of you. So they get like nervous. And I find that, I mean, there have been a bunch of people who, when I first started off doing all this stuff, I like asked them if they wanted to record something and they would ignore me. But then like 6 months later, 1 year later, I have more followers. Clearly there's like, I have a signal, like there are people who get it and are into it, and there's a growing audience. Then those people come out of the woodwork and then they're like, oh yeah, I want to do your live stream. So you get that kind of shit. I'm kind of currently in this type of problem, or I'm at like a new plateau of this, where, cause I'm not super famous and I'm not like super huge, but I have enough listeners and subscribers and readers that I'm now kind of like in this new like plateau, or new kind of, I guess, like level of influence or whatever you want to call it. And so I'm now basically like worthwhile for other people to want to be on my show. But a lot of those people are, so those are the people who will kind of like hit me up, or they'll like say that they want to do it, but then I find that they're hard to actually get a time and date booked with. And my theory is, I don't know, I might just be making this up, but my theory is that um, those people are hesitant and a little fearful, I think, because I don't really fit into any ideological groove. Like, I'm not in any camp, I'm not in on any team. And people, like the to the degree stuff is written about me by like third parties, it is stuff saying, oh, he's a reactionary, he's this or that. And so it's like people, even the more independent people, it's like hard to really trust your own independent judgment when like different people are saying different things. So I'm at this like kind of awkward period where I can see this playing out because I've already been through it at earlier stages in the process. By the way, I'm only going into this because I think it's really useful for people who want to do this kind of stuff. You observe these weird dynamics and how you're perceived and who wants a piece of you and who doesn't. But basically the moral of the story is ultimately a really good and hopefully empowering one, which is it doesn't actually matter. And that if you just stick with it, like the people right now who, say they want to do my show and are kind of open to, or they want me on their show or whatever, are kind of open to it, but then they kind of vacillate. These people, I'm telling you right now, within 6 months, like they'll want me on their show, or they'll want to be on my show, or maybe it'll take a year or whatever. But it's definitely going to come because, and this actually kind of goes back to one of the points Joel was making today. It's like everyone is just getting their cues from this like signifying regime, and guess what determines the essential dynamics of that signifying regime? It's ultimately just power. So like if you have the discipline and the intelligence or whatever, the different traits that allow you to keep building content that makes sense and is good and is real and is worthwhile, then simply by growing your own audience, you're going to become desirable to these people who are on the fence. And that's kind of sad. It's kind of like superficial that our society is, people's decisions about who they want to collaborate with or whatever is so determined by this mimetic rivalry, like hall of mirrors. But it's ultimately when you see it and you realize that, it's actually kind of demystifying and it's empowering, because then you're ultimately like, oh, it's not about me at all. It's not about me at all. It's this like really analytical cold machine that no one really has any power over changing. But if you just keep doing your shit and you build your own power, then everyone ultimately comes around to you. And so it's like, yeah, it kind of leads to some arrogant or kind of nasty, like will to power kinds of ideas. Cause you're just like, all right, if you don't want to be on my show now, fuck it. I'm going to accrue my own power and build my empire. And then I'll show you, and then I'll get you on my show. It can definitely lead to those kinds of like perverse, kind of like power fixations or something like that. But ultimately, it is essentially kind of just like power is essentially what determines social perceptions. But ultimately, that's a good thing. So it just means like, all right, be smart, be clever, be patient, get more power, and then people will ultimately, come around to you. All right, I'm fried. This is good. Thanks, Ben, for helping.
Thanks for allowing me to help.
I think we should officially kick this. What do you think? Bye, everyone. Thank you.